The station of Veyron Keep was not a quiet place. It hummed with noise from 100 different species, 100 different languages, and the low vibration of engines that never fully stopped. Ships docked and left at all hours. Vendors sold food that smelled strange to some and familiar to others. Soldiers walked the corridors in groups, their armor painted with the colors of their home worlds. And in the very center of the station, behind thick walls of reinforced glass and steel, sat the Grand Arena. Every 3 years, the Galactic Coalition held its tournament here. Warriors from across known space were invited to compete. Some came for glory. Some came because their governments sent them. Some came for the prize credits. But all of them came believing they were the best fighter their world had to offer. The Drevathi Empire had sent Krivas, their champion of 3 consecutive tournaments. The Brakari clans had sent their largest warrior, a bull-shaped creature named Garath who stood nearly 7 feet tall and weighed as much as a small vehicle. The Veth Collective had sent a sleek, fast assassin whose name translated roughly to one who ends things quickly. Every delegation had arrived with confidence. The human delegation had arrived with a man named Cole. Cole was not large. He was not decorated. He wore simple gray clothing and carried a small bag over one shoulder. When the Coalition's registration desk asked him to list his combat rank and training history, he handed them a single form with very little written on it. The registration officer, a 4-armed being from the Zolani system, looked at the form, then looked at Cole, then looked at the form again. Cole smiled politely and waited. The officer stamped the form and let him through. Princess Aelvira of the Drevathi Empire watched all of this from the royal observation deck. She had a clear view of the registration area below, and she had seen every delegation arrive. She had studied each warrior with careful eyes, noting their size, their posture, the way they moved. She was not a fighter herself, but she had grown up surrounded by fighters, and she knew how to read them. The Brakari warrior Garath had walked in like he owned the floor. Good. Confidence in a fighter was useful. The Veth assassin had moved so smoothly that Aelvira almost missed him entering altogether. Also good. Quiet killers were always interesting to watch. Krivas, her own empire's champion, had arrived with ceremony and music and a full honor guard. She had smiled at that. Krivas understood the value of presence. And then there was Cole. He had walked in behind a family of Naluvian traders, almost hidden by their wide bodies and large bags. He had stood in the registration line with his hands in his pockets. He had yawned once while waiting. When his turn came, he had exchanged a few short words with the officer, smiled, and walked off toward the competitor quarters with his small bag bouncing against his hip. Elvira had watched him go with a small frown on her face. Her advisor, Counselor San, stood beside her. San was tall even for a Drevathi, with long fingers that he always seemed to be pressing together when he was thinking. He said, without looking up from his datapad, "The human is a last-minute replacement. Their original competitor suffered an injury during transit. This one was pulled from the delegation staff. He is listed as a civilian contractor." Aelvira said nothing. She kept watching the corridor where Cole had disappeared. San continued, "He has no tournament record. No listed rank. His background before joining the human delegation is sealed under something called privacy statutes." He added, in a tone that made his opinion very clear, "The humans have essentially sent a placeholder." Aelvira finally looked away from the corridor. She picked up her glass of cold shinwater and said nothing more about it. But she made a small note in the back of her mind, the kind she made when something did not quite fit where it was supposed to. The first day of competition began the next morning. Cole's first match was against Garath of the Brakari clans. The arena was full. The crowd was loud. Garath entered to roars and stamping feet. The Brakari section of the audience banged their thick fists against the railing in a rhythm that made the floor vibrate. Garath flexed, raised both his massive arms, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a roar and a thunder crack. Cole entered from the opposite side. The human section of the audience, which was much smaller, gave a polite cheer. Cole raised one hand briefly in acknowledgement and then lowered it. He looked at Garath. He tilted his head slightly, like a person reading a sign they were not quite sure about. The match began. Garath charged immediately. He was very fast for his size, which was always the terrifying thing about Brakari warriors. They looked too big to be quick, and then they were already on top of you. The crowd leaned forward. Cole moved to the side. Not a dramatic jump, not a roll. He just stepped, cleanly, to a place where Garath was not going to be. Garatha's momentum carried him past. Cole watched him go. Garath turned and charged again. Again, Cole moved. He did not strike. He did not shout. He just relocated, calm and quiet, to a different part of the arena floor. This happened 4 times. On the 5th charge, something changed. Cole did not just step aside. He placed one hand, very briefly, on Garatha's shoulder as the big creature went past. It was so light a contact that half the crowd missed it. But Garath stumbled on his next step. Just slightly. Just enough. It was over in the next 30 seconds. Nobody watching could fully explain what had happened. Garath was on the ground. Cole was standing 2 feet away, breathing normally. The match was called. The arena was not as loud as it had been a few minutes before. Up in the observation deck, Elvira set down her glass very carefully. San was already typing something into his datapad. She did not look at him. She was looking at Cole, who was walking back to the competitor area. He was not celebrating. He was not performing for the crowd. He was looking around the arena slowly, as if he was memorizing the exits. Elvira thought, that was not a fight. She did not yet have the word for what it was. But something in the back of her careful mind was already searching for it. The second day of the tournament brought a different energy to Veyron Keep. Word had spread overnight, the way word always spreads on a station where thousands of beings live in close quarters and have nothing better to do than talk. The story of Cole and the Brakari warrior Garath had been told and retold across every corridor, every eating hall, and every crew lounge on the station. Most people told it with disbelief. A small, unranked human had beaten a Brakari champion. It had to be some kind of trick. Or maybe Garath had been injured already, before the match. Or maybe the scoring had been wrong. There was always an explanation that made more sense than the simple one. Cole, for his part, spent the morning sitting in the competitor commons with a cup of something hot and a stack of thin information sheets that the coalition handed out to all participants. The sheets contained general facts about competing species, body types, common fighting styles, dietary needs. Most competitors glanced at them briefly and then set them aside. Cole read his from the first page to the last, slowly, and then he read them again. A young human aide from the delegation, a woman named Petra, brought him a second cup of the hot drink and asked if he needed anything else. Cole looked up, thanked her, and asked if she could get him the arena's maintenance schedule for the day. He wanted to know when the floor surface would be cleaned, because different cleaning compounds left different textures, and texture mattered. Petra stared at him for a moment. Then she wrote it down and went to find out. Cole's second match was scheduled for the afternoon. His opponent was the Veth Assassin, a creature the tournament program described only as fast and highly adaptive. The Veth were not a well-documented species. They kept to themselves, shared little information with outside races, and their fighters had a habit of winning in ways that the post-match footage never quite captured clearly. This particular Veth had a temporary designation for the tournament, Competitor 7. It had not lost a match in 4 previous tournaments. It had won all of them in under 15 seconds. The arena filled up more than it had the day before. Even beings who had not planned to watch the afternoon matches found themselves drifting toward the observation levels. Something about Cole's first match had been strange enough that people wanted to see if it would happen again, or if it had simply been a strange accident. Princess Elvira was already in her seat when the match was announced. Counselor San sat beside her with his datapad. He had pulled up the Veth competitor's file and was reading it quietly. He said, without looking up, the Veth has a short-range phase shift ability. It can become visually undetectable for approximately 4 seconds at a time. Then it needs several seconds to recover before it can do it again. Elvira nodded. She knew about Veth phase shifts. She had seen one used in combat before. The creature vanished, you lost track of it, and then something sharp was at your throat from a direction you had not expected. It was fast, and it was effective, and it was very hard to counter. She watched Cole enter the arena. He was carrying something in his left hand that he had not carried yesterday. It looked like a strip of dark cloth, folded loosely. In his right hand he held a small, flat piece of broken tile, pale gray, the kind used on the arena's exterior walkways. A coalition guard at the arena entrance had stopped him to look at these items. Cole had explained something to the guard. The guard had checked with a superior. The superior had shrugged. The items were not prohibited. Cole had walked in. Son looked up from his datapad and said flatly, "What is the human carrying?" Elvira said, "I do not know yet." Competitor 7, the Veth assassin, entered from the other side. It moved the way all Veth moved, close to the ground, almost boneless, each step placed with extreme care. Its eyes were large and pale, and they did not blink. It regarded Cole the way a blade regards a surface it is about to cross. The match signal sounded. Competitor 7 vanished. The crowd made a sharp collective sound, half gasp and half murmur. The arena floor was suddenly occupied by only one visible being, and that being was Cole. He stood still. He let out a slow breath. He closed his eyes. The crowd was completely silent for 3 seconds. Cole tilted his head to the right. Very slightly, like a person who has heard something faint from a particular direction. Then he took 3 steps to his left and turned around. Competitor 7 reappeared directly behind where Cole had just been standing. Its forward momentum was already committed. It was moving toward a target that was no longer there. Cole was behind it. The cloth went around the Veth's neck. The tilepiece pressed against a point just below its left mandible, at the junction of 2 nerve clusters that Cole had read about in a species medical reference document he had borrowed from the station's public information terminal 2 days before the tournament began. The Veth went rigid. Then it went still. Then it tapped the arena floor twice with one long finger, which was the universal coalition signal for yielding. 4 seconds had passed since the match started. The arena did not cheer immediately. There was a long pause, the kind that happens when a crowd is trying to understand what it just saw before it decides how to respond to it. Up in the observation deck, Elvira was on her feet. She was not cheering either. She turned to Son and said, her voice very quiet, "Stop the match." Son looked at her. "The match is over, Your Highness. The Veth has yielded." She knew that. She had seen it. But something was wrong, and she could not yet name it clearly enough to explain it. So she stood there with her hands pressed flat on the railing and watched Cole set the tilepiece down neatly at the edge of the arena floor and walk back to the competitor area. He did not look at the crowd. He did not raise his hand. He looked at the arena exit and then, for just a moment, he looked up at the observation decks, slowly, the way a person looks at a room they are trying to memorize. His eyes did not stay on Elvira's face longer than they stayed anywhere else. But she felt certain, in a way she could not fully justify, that he had seen her. Grace, the human delegation's diplomat, was sitting in the human section below. A colleague leaned over and whispered something to her. Grace answered quietly, and the colleague looked surprised, and then looked at Cole, and then looked more surprised. Elvira could not hear what was said. But Son, who had very good ears and had been scanning the human section with a directional audio device, read from his notes a moment later. The human diplomat told her colleague that Cole had spent the previous 2 evenings in the station library reviewing Veth anatomical texts. Elvira stared at the arena floor for a long time. She said, "How long is the list of species competing in this tournament?" Son said, 31. She said, "And how many anatomical texts do you think exist in the station library?" Son did not answer. He closed his datapad and looked at Cole, who had sat down in the competitor area and picked up his information sheets again. That evening, Princess Elvira of the Drevathi Empire did something she had not done at a tournament before. She sent a formal inquiry. The inquiry was addressed to the human diplomatic delegation and requested, in polite but direct language, a full accounting of their competitor's background. Combat rank. Training institution. Service record. Medical classification. Anything the Coalition's standard disclosure rules allowed to be shared between delegations. She sent it through the official station messaging system and received a response within the hour. The response came from Grace, the human diplomat. It was also polite and also direct. Competitor Cole held no formal combat rank, as the human systems of ranking did not apply to him. He had not attended a training institution in the Coalition's recognized sense. His service record prior to joining the human delegation was sealed under Earth Standard Privacy Statutes, which the Coalition had ratified in the Third Compact. Anything else the princess wished to know would require a direct formal request to Earth's government, which Grace estimated would take approximately 6 to 8 months to process. Grace had added, at the bottom of the message, a single additional line. If the princess had other questions, she was welcome to arrange a brief meeting. Humans were generally happy to talk. Elvira read this message 3 times. Then she set her datapad down on the table in her private quarters and looked out the wide window at the dark shape of space beyond the station's hull. Son appeared in the doorway. He had been managing her schedule and had been expecting her to retire for the evening. When he saw her expression, he came in and stood quietly and waited. She said, "Arrange the meeting." They met the following morning, in a small side chamber off the main competitor corridor. The room had a low table and 4 chairs and nothing else. Cole arrived alone, 2 minutes before the scheduled time. He was wearing the same kind of plain gray clothing he wore everywhere. He sat down and folded his hands on the table and waited. Elvira arrived with Son. She sat across from Cole. Son stood to one side with his datapad, which he held the way he always held it, ready but not open. Elvira studied Cole for a moment before she spoke. He was younger than she had expected, though it was sometimes hard to judge human ages. His face was calm in a way that was almost unsettling. Not the calm of someone who was pretending to be relaxed. The calm of someone who genuinely was, for reasons that had nothing to do with the room or the situation. She said, "I have reviewed the footage of your 2 matches. I have watched them several times. I want to ask you directly, what are you doing in the arena?" Cole looked at her. He said, "Learning the room." She waited to see if he would add more. He did not. She said, "That is not an answer. I have watched warriors compete my entire life. I was raised in a family that has produced military officers for 11 generations. I know what a fighter looks like when they enter a competition. You do not look like that." Cole tilted his head slightly, the same small movement she had seen him make in the arena before the Veth match. He said, "What does a fighter look like?" She said, "A fighter is ready. A fighter is present. A fighter is thinking about the match. When you walk into the arena, you look like you are thinking about something else entirely." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am thinking about the match. I am just thinking about it differently." She leaned forward slightly. She said, "Then tell me how." He looked at her for a long moment. She got the impression he was deciding something, not about whether to trust her, but about how to explain something to a person who had not grown up thinking the way he thought. He said, "When most fighters enter an arena, they are thinking about what they will do. I am thinking about what my opponent cannot do. There is a difference. A fighter who thinks about what he will do is planning. I am not planning. I am understanding. Once you understand something completely enough, you do not need a plan. The outcome is already there. You just walk toward it." Elvira stared at him. She said, "That sounds like a theory." "The arena is not a theory." He said, "No. But the beings in it are. Every species has a shape. Not a body shape. A shape to the way they move. The way they think under pressure. The things they will always do and the things they cannot stop themselves from doing. I study that shape until I know it better than they do." She said, "And then you fight them." He paused. Then he said, "No. And then I do not need to." There was a silence in the room. Son shifted his weight slightly. Elvira became aware that she had been holding her breath and let it out slowly. She said, "You said learning the room. But you have already competed in the room twice. What are you still learning?" Cole looked at her with something in his eyes that she would think about later and not be able to name. He said, "I am learning who else is in it." He paused, then added, "Your Highness." She sat back in her chair. She wanted to press further, but something told her that she had already gotten more than he usually gave. She said, after a moment, "Who is your next opponent?" He said, "A Rethalai blade specialist. I have 2 days." She said, "Is that enough time?" He said, "I already started yesterday." He stood, thanked her for the meeting in the formal phrasing that was standard between delegations, and left. The door closed behind him without a sound. Elvira sat at the table for a long time. Son waited. He was good at waiting. Finally she said, "He is not fighting in that arena." Son said, "He has won 2 matches, Your Highness." She said, "I know. But he is not fighting. He is something else." She picked up her datapad, looked at the tournament schedule, and thought about Krivis. Her empire's champion. The 3-time winner. The warrior who had never been beaten in this arena. She thought about Cole reading anatomical texts in a public library the night before a match. She thought about how many nights were left before the semi-final. She put the datapad down without saying anything else. The semi-final was the match that everyone on Veyron Keep had been building toward, though most of them would not have predicted it would look like this. Krivis, champion of the Drevathi Empire and winner of 3 consecutive Galactic Coalition tournaments, was a figure that the station's population had heard about for years. He was not merely large, though he was very large. He was not merely fast, though he was faster than a creature his size had any right to be. He was the product of 30 years of training, competition, and refinement. He had studied under masters on 4 different worlds. He had traveled specifically to face the best opponents he could find, in small matches and large ones, until there was almost nothing left that could surprise him. He was also, to be clear, a creature of enormous pride. This was not a flaw, exactly. Pride in the Drevathi tradition was a virtue. It meant you knew your worth and you defended it. Krivis entered every arena knowing that he was the best thing in it, and he performed accordingly. The roars, the ceremony, the armor with its painted tournament victories, the full honor guard that walked him to the arena entrance, these were not vanity. They were a statement. This is what excellence looks like. Take note. The Drevathi section of the arena audience was packed so tightly that the ushers had quietly stopped trying to manage it. Flags were raised. Drums were playing. 3 of the Drevathi honor representatives had dressed in full ceremonial colors. When Krivis walked through the arena entrance and raised his arms, the sound from that section of the crowd was loud enough to feel in the chest. Elvira was in her seat. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was watching the competitor entrance on the opposite side of the arena. Cole came through the door. He was eating something. A piece of flatbread, folded in half. He walked to his designated waiting area, finished the last of it, folded the small paper wrapping carefully, and set it on the bench beside him. Then he stepped out onto the arena floor and looked at Krivis with no particular expression on his face. The Drevathi section of the crowd was not entirely sure how to respond to this. Some of them laughed. Some of them went quiet. Krivis himself stared at Cole with something that began as contempt and ended, very quickly, as focus. Whatever else Krivis was, he had not won 3 tournaments by underestimating opponents. The match signal sounded. For the first 90 seconds, Cole did not approach. He moved, but he moved away from Krivis, or around him, in slow drifting arcs that kept a comfortable distance. Krivis advanced 4 times. Each time, Cole adjusted. Not dramatically. Not with any wasted motion. He simply was somewhere slightly different than where Krivis was heading. The crowd began to grow uneasy. This was not what a semi-final was supposed to look like. Krivis was a champion. He was supposed to be striking, advancing, demonstrating the technique that had made him famous across a dozen star systems. Instead, he was chasing a small human around an arena floor while the human appeared to be on a quiet afternoon walk. Krivis changed his approach. He slowed down. He began to use the positioning techniques that had served him well against larger opponents, boxing in angles, cutting off routes, forcing the weaker fighter to commit to a direction. It was smart fighting. He was adjusting. But as Krivis slowed down and became more strategic, Cole stopped avoiding and started approaching. And what he did was so subtle that the main camera feeds almost missed it entirely. It took the footage review teams, analyzing it frame by frame later that evening, to fully document what happened during those minutes. Cole touched Krivis. Not strikes. Contacts. Light, precise, placed with exact care. A shoulder joint, hit at a very specific angle that did not damage anything but briefly interrupted a signal pathway. The side of a knee, pressed in a way that activated the joint stabilization response and very slightly altered its resting position. A point below the left side of Krivis's jaw, where 2 large nerve branches ran close to the surface. None of these were prohibited. Cole had checked. He had gone through the Coalition's full list of banned techniques for Drevathi competitors 4 days before the match, and had read the anatomical descriptions carefully to understand what the list was actually protecting. Everything he used was just outside those lines. Crevis did not feel these contacts as pain. They were too light for that. He felt them as distractions, brief irritations, and he was disciplined enough to push them aside and keep fighting. This was his error. Not a failure of training. Simply a failure of information. He did not know what was being done to him. By the 3rd minute, Crevis was favoring his left side without knowing why. His reach on that side had shortened by approximately 4 inches as the shoulder joint unconsciously protected itself. By the 4th minute, his footwork had changed. The knee adjustment had altered his weight distribution, and his body was compensating automatically, the way a body always does, without telling the mind. By the 5th minute, Crevis was fighting at perhaps 70% of his actual capacity, and he did not know it. He thought he was fighting well. He was trying everything he had. He could not understand why nothing was landing. Cole ended it with 2 fingers and a single controlled step. The exact technique would be debated by coaches and analysts for months afterward. The simple description was, he moved Crevis's weight to precisely the point where Crevis's own unconsciously compromised balance could not hold it, and Crevis went down. The 3-time champion hit the arena floor with a sound like a tree falling in a quiet forest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Elvira stood up and screamed. It was not a cheer and it was not a wail. It was an alarm. She shouted to the floor marshal, loudly enough that the nearest section of the crowd went quiet and turned to look at her. She said, "Stop the match. Something is wrong. The human is not competing by the rules. There is something wrong." The floor marshal reviewed the footage. It took 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, Cole sat on the bench in the competitor area and drank from a small water container. Crevis was helped to a seated position. He was not seriously injured. He was confused, which, for Crevis, was far worse. The floor marshal's review found no violations. Every contact had been legal. Every technique was within Coalition guidelines. The match result stood. Grace, sitting in the human section, said quietly to the colleague beside her, "He spent a week on Drevathi anatomy before the tournament started." Her colleague looked at her. She said, "Just the week before. He started the night we arrived on station." Her colleague looked at Cole. Cole had finished his water and set the container down neatly beside the flatbread wrapper. "In the observation deck," Son said to Elvira, very carefully, "the review is complete, Your Highness." No violations were found. Elvira did not respond immediately. She was looking at Crevis, who was being helped by his honor guard. Her champion. Her empire's pride. 3 consecutive titles. 30 years of training. 6 minutes. She sat down slowly. She said, to no one in particular, he was not fighting Crevis. Son said, "Your Highness?" She said, Crevis was fighting Cole. Cole was not fighting Crevis. She stopped. She did not have better words for it than that, not yet. But she could feel the shape of it, like a cold thing pressing against a window from outside. Elvira filed a formal protest that evening. She did it correctly and thoroughly, the way she did most things. She cited specific Coalition statutes. She requested an independent review of the match footage by a neutral panel. She used precise language that left nothing open to misinterpretation. She sent copies to the Coalition's tournament committee, to her own government's diplomatic office, and to 3 senior Coalition arbiters whose names she had memorized for exactly this kind of situation. The response came back the following morning. The review panel had examined the footage. The match was valid. No violations had occurred. The protest was noted and formally dismissed. Cole would advance to the final. She read the response. She set it down. She did not protest again. Instead, she went to find Cole. She found him in the same place she had seen him several times now, in the competitor commons, with something to drink and papers in front of him. He was reading. She dismissed the 2 aides who had accompanied her and sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. He looked up, marked his place in the document he was reading with 1 finger, and waited. She said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly." He said, "I will try." She said, Did you know, from the very beginning of this tournament, that you would eventually face Crevis? He said, I knew it was possible. When I looked at the bracket and the seedings, it was the most probable path for both of us if we kept winning. So yes, I prepared for it. She said, you prepared for it before you had even competed in your first match. He said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, why did you not simply train to fight him? Practice the techniques you would use against a Drevathi opponent. Prepare specific counters for his known style. That is what any serious competitor would do. Cole put his papers down flat on the table. He said, those things are what you do when you are going to fight someone. I was not going to fight Crevis. She said, you were in the same arena. He was your opponent. What would you call it? Cole said, I would call it a conclusion. Fighting means two people are still deciding how it ends. What I do means I have already decided how it ends before we are ever in the same room. The arena is where I confirm it, not where I figure it out. She stared at him. She said, that is an extraordinary thing to believe about yourself. He said, without any arrogance in his voice at all, it is not about me. It is just how it works. If you understand something completely enough, it cannot protect itself from you anymore. Not because you are stronger or faster. Because you have already been inside every decision it will make before it makes them. You are ahead of it before it starts. She said, and you believe you understood Crevis completely. He said, I believed I understood him well enough. There is always some margin. That is why there is still a match at all. She was quiet for a longer time now. She was watching his face, looking for the pride or the performance that she expected to find somewhere. She did not find it. He was stating facts the way a person states facts about weather or distance. Things that simply are. She said, what is the difference between a fighter and a hunter? He looked at her steadily. He said, a fighter meets you where you are. He comes into the same space and he contests it. He is brave and he is skilled and he is trying to win. A hunter decides, before you ever meet, where you are going to be. He does not contest the space. He is already at the end of it. She said, and humans are hunters. He thought about this for a moment. He said, humans are both. We can fight. We do fight. But when we have time to prepare, when we have information and we have patience, we become something else. Something that does not feel like a threat until it is already finished. She said, are you going to win the final? He picked his papers back up. He said, I do not know yet. He turned a page. He said, I have not finished reading. She sat there for another moment. Then she stood, thanked him in the formal phrase, and left. On the day of the final, she sat in the observation deck and watched Cole compete against the Rethali Blade Specialist, a fighter who had been considered by many observers to be the strongest technical competitor in the tournament outside of Crevis. The match lasted 6 minutes and 12 seconds. The Rethali did not yield so much as simply run out of options, one by one, until there were none left and Cole was standing at a point that made the match geometrically over. The crowd did not roar when it ended. They were quiet. Even the sections that had been loud all week. The quiet was not respectful silence exactly. It was the quiet of a room where people are trying to understand something they saw and have not yet found a category for. San, standing beside Elvira, said after a long moment, he won the tournament. She said, yes. San said, our formal response to the home government will need to be drafted. They will have questions about Crevis's performance. She said, I will write it myself. She did write it herself, that evening, in her quarters. She wrote the standard sections first, the match results, the diplomatic outcomes, the coalition standings update. And then she wrote the final section, which she spent more time on than all the others combined. She wrote, the human competitor Cole won the tournament without using conventional combat in any traditional sense. He won by studying. By accumulating information about opponents with what appears to be extreme precision and depth, and then using that information to make every match a conclusion rather than a contest. He did not defeat Crevis. He made Crevis's defeat inevitable before they ever shared a floor. She paused. She thought about how to say the next part. She wrote, what concerns me is not Cole specifically. Cole is one human, and he is apparently considered unremarkable by human standards. What concerns me is the implication. Humans do not enter arenas to prove themselves. They do not come to contest. They come to understand what is inside. And once they understand something, they do not need to fight it. She wrote the final line slowly. She wrote, "Do not engage humans in any competition you care about winning. By the time the contest begins, it is already over. The question you should be asking is not whether you can beat the human in the room. The question is how long ago he started reading about you." She sent the report. She closed her datapad. She sat for a while in the quiet of her quarters, looking out at the dark shape of space. Somewhere on the station, she knew, Cole was probably already in a library, reading something about someone. She thought about what it must feel like to walk through a galaxy full of species you had not yet studied, and to feel not threatened by any of them, but simply curious, simply interested, simply patient. She thought that might be the most dangerous feeling in the known universe. And she thought that humans had probably felt it for a very long time.